Coogs House. We all know part of the excitement in hiring Willie Fritz is that we feel like he's the guy that can turn Houston into a program that can win the Big 12. But is the Big 12 going to get even bigger?
You are Locked On Coogs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to stop by, thank you for making Locked On Coogs your first listen of the day. If you want to join the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below what your favorite seafood dish is. Because honestly, if it's Pacific Northwest salmon, you might be in luck very shortly. Now, I want to talk about a couple things that have to do with conference alignment. I also want to talk about potential AD search updates, question mark. But first and foremost, I think we need to establish the news of the day happening with the Big 12, and that is that we're hearing more and more stuff surrounding the idea that a couple of teams from the pack, what is left of the pack, may be on their way to the Big 12. I want to talk about that. And then the second segment, I want to make sure we talk about what that means for Houston specifically. And then the third and final segment, obviously, that AD bit that I want to make sure we get in today's show. Now, today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Best place to get tickets for whatever you're looking for, even if it's the surging Astros right now. More on that and the fun with them later. I got to get some credit to Drake Toll on this one. I've been talking to Drake some and listening to Drake some over at Locked On Big 12. He has a couple of the guests on too, and I go dive into their stuff. And it feels like there is real momentum behind the Big 12 expanding even bigger, right? The Big 12 got bigger when they added Houston and Central Florida and BYU and and Cincinnati, right, all at one time. They lost Texas Oklahoma. They lose 2, pull in 4, getting bigger. Then they add Colorado and the rest of the 4 corner schools last summer for this upcoming calendar or this upcoming school calendar year, right? That obviously adds 4 more schools. We're up to 16 schools in the Big 12. Yormark is doing all kinds of innovative things, talking about potential private equity here, adding sponsorships in the name of the conference there, etc. One thing he's been consistent on in that growth is that he has a desire for the conference to truly go coast to coast. And most expansion talks have been focused on the fall of the ACC, right? It feels somewhat inevitable that depending on how the ruling here goes with Florida State and Clemson, that the 2 biggest brands, or certainly the biggest brand in Florida State, could be on their way out of the ACC. Does that conference fall apart without those kinds of folks in there? Or do other folks want whatever Florida State gets out of that lawsuit? What does that do to the conference? Yada, yada, yada. The thing falls apart. That's where a lot of expansion talk has been focused, because that would leave a lot of large brands and players out in the open. What people haven't thought about or haven't talked as much about until fairly recently is what is going to happen with these 2 schools in the Pac-2, right? What is left of a former Power 5 conference is up for debate. Now, it is worth pointing out that after the lawsuit, they cannot leave the conference formally. They really had to stay in the Pac-2 until August 3rd, 2026, right? So just before the 2026 football season. If they stay in the conference through that point, then theoretically they get the full payout of whatever their lawsuit is, right? That being said, with them being in the Pac-2, they kind of have this nice exclusive deal where ESPN and their family of networks are going to be showing a lot of Pac-2 games. They're going to get some coverage and things like that. And it makes sense that ESPN would like to see that investment in these 2 programs, these 2 athletic departments in the next 24 months. They like to see that pay off towards them being in a power conference worth discussing on the ESPN family of networks, or the network family of shows, etc., come the 2026 school year, not fall into a group of 5 conference or whatever, right? And so ESPN and other TV networks involved have motivation to help navigate a deal where Oregon State and Washington State get into a power conference. They're going to have to put some TV time invested into these programs. It makes sense that that would pay off by them ultimately being in a bigger conference later. You pair that with Yormark and his idea of wanting to go coast to coast, and people are connecting dots across the Twitter sphere. Some people have more influence than say than others. Some people say that they have a bunch of sources. Some people really do have a bunch of undercover sources, yada, 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 right? You've heard the conference expansion talks before, and I will say the thing that consistently comes up with this is when there starts to be a certain amount of smoke, there is a fire. It was the case with Colorado. Frankly, if you want to go far enough back, it was the case with Houston. It feels like that might be the case here as well because ESPN is a big part of what Houston and the Big 12 are doing. They've promised the pro rata to other power conference schools. Well, theoretically, that would be also Oregon State and Washington State. It does take the conference truly coast to coast. The Big 12 kind of gets to scapegoat that right now because during football season, the Arizona schools are in the West Coast Pacific time zone. They don't observe daylight savings time there, right? And so they're kind of skirting that a little bit by saying they go across all 4 time zones during football season. Adding Oregon State and Washington State would really solidify that. It also adds states to the conference. If you're trying to sell Big 12 package deals and stuff like that on more traditional cable television, that does matter because suddenly everyone in Oregon that is an Oregon State fan or everyone watching, there's a Washington State fan, and those are both big, big fan base. I want to circle back to that in a second. That would mean they all have to buy Big 12 packaging of network things, right? The other thing about this is that you're not just adding states for the TV networks or not just elevating these programs that are going to get ESPN coverage the next 2 years, etc. What you're really doing is bringing in 2 large fan bases. I cannot stress enough that these are 2 schools with very dedicated, large fan bases. We think about like Oregon and Phil Knight and the money and stuff like that, or Washington's had some strong football success the last couple of years, and obviously who knows what they're going to be like with DeBoer gone or whatever, right? But truthfully, I mean, Washington State and the Washington State flag at College game day, Pullman's a great town. Oregon State's got the Beavers and their history there in Washington. It's kind of like the Civil War fight with Oregon, right? Across the board, both these programs have strong, dedicated donors and fan bases. And for what it's worth, if they were in the Big 12 in the present tense, right, they would be in the top half of the conference in viewership, right? And that is, I think, why ESPN's like, let's make sure we get them into that conference. I think it's a good thing. We'll talk about this when we get to the Houston segment in a moment. But they're not just saying they want to join them with any conference, right? And they're going to throw them to the ACC or the Big 10 or whatever. They're trying to angle to get them into the Big 12. Part of that, I think, is that the pro rata deal where every power school will get this equivalent share from the ESPN family of networks, family of shows. Like you say, family of networks, family of shows. As we get towards that next conference realignment due date where the TV deals re-up in 2031. Between 2026 and then they'd get a full cut, right? That's why ESPN has some power in this, is that they'd be paying the largest dividend of that. Now, as far as adding the schools goes from a conference perspective, before we get to the Houston perspective, I have to say, if you're going to continue to add West Coast schools, it makes total sense to me, right? They seem very like-minded in the sense of the cultural standpoint, the rest of the conference, passionate fans in their states, right? They've also got a great football cultures as far as game day experience goes. It'd be a great place to travel for those football games. I know people want to talk about how all of a sudden your softball teams are going to be going from UCF to Washington State, but football money is what drives this. And unfortunately, and for those softball athletes, that's been a week away from school. But like that is really what's going to happen in this, right? It's going to be whatever the football money dictates. I think it makes total sense. I was a little surprised when the Big 12 didn't take them in the first place. And frankly, I think that's the only compelling argument for why this didn't happen or hasn't happened yet. It's like, well, if the Big 12 and Brett Yormark wanted them independently of ESPN, then they probably would have taken them back when they took the Four Corners schools, right? They would have accepted and just made the conference bigger, get up to 18 teams, bing, bang, boom, we're coast to coast, right? This feels like an ESPN play because they didn't add them then, and they continue to be linked to them now. Now, ESPN has the dollars and has the sense to get this done. And frankly, if ESPN says, hey, we need this to get done, Big 12, Yormark's hands are kind of tied. ESPN pays all of Brett Yormark's bosses. He has to do what they say. And I feel like that's the only reason it's still getting discussed. It's not getting finalized in August of 2024 because that could potentially invalidate the lawsuit or the ruling in the lawsuit where they need to stay in the Pac-2 through 2026, August of 2026, right? However, this is the 24-25 school year. Start paying attention to the leaks and rumors as we get closer to next summer, right? We can say officially we're announcing year out in August of 25 that on August 4th of 26, boom, bang, boom, they're coming over to the Big 12. Now, I want to talk about how this all could potentially impact Houston in a second because it's going to be very specific to the Cougs because of where the Cougs fall in this conference. But first, I want to make sure that if you are spending the summertime traveling to the Pacific Northwest or wherever you are, if you're trying to find things to do, you can make sure you find tickets to do those things on the Game Time app, whether it's a concert, a theater performance, a comedy show, a baseball game where the Astros are going to go meet the Seattle Mariners or whatever. You can find those tickets on Game Time. They have all kinds of low price guarantees to make sure you're getting the lowest price guaranteed. They give you credit back on the 110% of the difference if you find tickets in the same section and row for less. They have flash deals and last minute deals and all in price. Make sure you're getting the best price and you know exactly what you're paying every single time. Take the guesswork out of buying those MLB tickets this summer with Game Time. Download the Game Time app today. Create an account and use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use code Locked On College, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, so we mentioned that the Big 12 conference is very realistically about to kind of have their hands tied and told you have to add these schools by ESPN, right? That feels like it could really happen, and it feels like it could happen as early as next summer for the 2026-27 school year, right? So summer of 25, saying, hey, 1 year from now, this thing is happening. And I think a lot of people, want to point out that like Houston and the schools that joined the Big 12 a couple of years ago, I guess last year being their first year in the conference, but announced it a couple of years ago, started this trend in a lot of ways. And that's fair. I think that's a very, frankly, as a Houston person, that's what I look at it like as well, is that this whole thing, the Big 12 probably dies if those four schools that include Houston don't come over. Texas, no, you leave. They've been down to 8 schools. Theoretically, a couple of them might have gone Big 10, and suddenly, boom, it's over. Right? Instead, schools, including Houston, come in and save the Big 12s behind, and now it's taking over, right? And as it's taking over, what you're seeing is people are starting to see the value of a power conference that is truly coast to coast and not just like hoity-toity academics like a lot of the Big 12, like a lot of the Big 10 is doing with their unofficial requirements to be an AAU member, and not just like kind of sort of coast to coast with like Rutgers over here or whatever, right? You've got a real effort to be a conference that can fit in every single TV window Friday or even Thursday through Sunday. They're looking at every single TV window Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday night, Thursday late night, whatever you're trying to do, you can find a Big 12 football game in football season. And it's really, really intentional where it can be any day, any night, any time, because I think that's kind of the future of this. Houston's got games this season on Fridays. Where you could talk about conflicting with Friday Night Lights, the former unwritten rule of college sports. However, right, it's a window, right, on a big time slate of games on a Saturday. It's like Ohio State and Oregon and a bunch of other big time college football games. Houston plays TCU Friday night. Yes, it's a big time Saturday with a bunch of games all over the country, but to kick it off, you've got Houston and TCU, right? And Houston found their way into this creative conference that's problem solving, right? And I think a lot of people were wondering, like, okay, well, like with Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12, what's the future of the Big 12 look like? Like, you got your in-state rival, up I-45 and SMU taking no TV dollars to join the ACC, a competitive Power Four conference that they felt like they could, with some wealthy donor money, whatever, scoot around a lot of the ways and kind of pay their way into being in, right? Does that speak poorly on the Big 12? It looks like, as far as TV networks are concerned, if they're going to be trying to push Oregon State and Washington State into the Big 12 and not the ACC, I mean, the ACC's got two other West Coast schools. They could have made a West Coast division. It made a whole lot of sense. Instead, they're saying, hey, Northwest and Southwest in Arizona, let's just make that one thing, right? They're picking the Big 12, which indicates that Houston picked the right pony. That's a big, big deal here. The other thing I'll say too is that a lot of people, when Houston joined the Big 12, were really eager to look at college football rivalries and in-state things. I want to play the Baylors, the TCUs, the Techs, the local teams. Yes, A&M and Texas would be great, but truthfully, just playing people that are close to home, that are power conferences, old Southwest Conference folks too, the Oklahoma States, the world, everybody, right? They want to make sure that those are the schools they're getting to play. Like Oklahoma State as well, I should have said, right? But the deal with that is that with this conference spreading out, suddenly it's like, okay, now we have to go to Arizona State. We got to go all the way to Provo, Utah. We got to go to Cincinnati. We got to go to Morgantown, right? Yes, potentially. As the conference adds more teams outside of Texas and its surrounding states, the divisions, pods, whatever kind of breakup you want of the conference for scheduling purposes continues to get more and more likely that Houston gets to keep up with their local, more familiar rivalries, right? As you add West Coast schools, you suddenly have a West Coast division. If you were to, with the ACC falling apart potentially, you could add some East Coast schools and have more East Coast. You suddenly could have the pods break up where Houston, in terms of a football schedule, is much closer to this Baylor division, right? This Tech division, this TCU division, Oklahoma State, etc. And suddenly, boom, you're playing those schools that you wanted to be playing in the first place more often, right? I also think that it's interesting to look at how this could impact Houston's football schedule, because with the Big 12 rules, where you have to play, or you're supposed to play, a Power 4, Power 5 team, a Group of 5 team, and an FCS team every single year in your non-conference, adding Oregon State to the Big 12 could throw a wrench in Houston's schedule, right? Houston is scheduled to play Oregon State in a home and home in 2025 and 2026. Houston would be going up to Oregon to play Oregon State in 2025 and then hosting Oregon State in 2026. If Brett Yormark and ESPN pull this off and add these two schools to the conference, which again, it looks like it could really happen, suddenly that 2025 game is a non-conference game and the 2026 game is a conference game. So you either throw both games out to kind of preserve the home and home, which would be a dead giveaway to the rest of the conference, the rest of the country. This is really happening. I repeat, if Houston suddenly reschedules, nixes, does something with that 2025 trip to Oregon to play Oregon State, that's the national signal that this is really happening, because you would not cancel that game in 2025 for any other reason other than the 2026 game is potentially a conference game, right? And if that's the case, you would need to find a new 2026 game. Well, Houston doesn't want to travel for a 2025 game and not get the reciprocated home and home in 2026. Suddenly they're out some money. They got to go find a Power 5 opponent to play 2025, 2026 back to back like that, right home and home. So pay attention to scheduling news for Houston, because Houston may weirdly be the first domino again that signals to the country this is really happening. Right now, we can go through schedules and find who has open weeks in 2025 and 2026. That's a Power 5 team that Houston could add instead. Honestly, I was kind of thinking it was fun to have the Oregon State matchup if that did not happen, but as it feels like it might, it's like, well, do you play, Power 5 team in the ACC? Do you mess with that when that may fall apart as well? Do you maybe get to play the A&Ms the world, or those, heaven forbid, you get to go play UT Austin again after how that controversial ending and when they came to Houston just last season, right? Something fun could happen out of that. And I don't mean to dismiss any of that by saying I kind of like the idea of getting to go play Oregon State and having that home and home. But it does not make sense to keep that if this is really about to happen. And I think it really might. Obviously, we'll be following it here at Locked On Coogs as it pertains to Houston and the Big 12. Now, bigger news out of Houston might have had nothing to do with Houston at all, might have had a lot to do with Houston at all, and that is something involving the AD search. I want to talk about that in a moment. But first, as any athletic director would be coming into Houston to build a championship caliber machine of a football program, they would need passion, drive, and patience, because that's the formula for winning championships. And they're also the formula for keeping your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for, and the eBay Guaranteed Fit. Your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need and the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride daily alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible ones only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, so Houston is presently kind of a D-list. They fired Chris Pesman earlier this summer, and then there's a report later that he's going to be kind of working at home, from home, while they're finishing their search and finding someone. I can't remember off the top of my head actually if it was through mid-August or late August, but theoretically, right, he was going to do some dotting of I's and crossing of T's until they had someone to replace him, but he was told he was fired in June, right? And the first name on most people's who's going to replace Chris Pesman list was Jeremiah Dickey of Boise State. Now, Jeremiah Dickey came to Houston many years ago to work with Mack Rhodes, right? Obviously, people go their separate ways. He's been a successful AD at Boise State. At Boise State, he helped launch different NIL programs and initiatives, player education on how to use that NIL money as well. Really grown their NIL program for a group of five school to a very respectable level, while also navigating a couple different coaching changes and things like that. His resume at Boise State was very, very strong, right? The other piece of this is that he made sense because he understood Houston. He was involved in raising a lot of money when he was at the University of Houston. He was at Houston for some, I would say, fairly successful hires, even if they got poached by people later. I think he made a lot of sense and checked a lot of boxes and was a lot of people's whole shot for getting the AD job. He just was. And then very suddenly, his name dropped off the list. People stopped talking about him. Duarte reported, I forget if it was in a podcast or in a written article for the Chronicle. I remember Duarte being first on, though, to say Jeremiah Dickey hadn't even really been contacted by the University of Houston a couple weeks into the search. And everyone started saying, wait a second, I thought this was a very real candidate. And people were confused, whether it's if you're on different message boards, social media sites, there are people kind of think, I thought this guy was our guy, and we're not even talking to him. And, everyone, I think, was balking at the idea that somehow that was Houston messing up, or so they all thought that, like, wait, Houston must have messed this up. There's no way they're not talking to the guy or whatever. And as recently as Wednesday, Jeremiah Dickey has now signed a massive contract extension with Boise State through the summer of 2029 that makes him one of the highest paid Group of 5 ADs in the country. And I'm here to tell you, it feels a lot like Houston got kind of played. I don't know who leaked out early on that Jeremiah Dickey was the candidate. I can tell you right now, a lot of legitimate reporting was done to say it after the fact, right? He makes a lot of sense on paper. And it feels like it turned into a lot of money in Jeremiah Dickey's pocket. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying I hate the player or hate the game. I am saying, though, that Houston, it doesn't seem like ever contacted him, but the national perception was they were. And since the national perception was they were, perception can become reality and help negotiate a fat extension for Jeremiah Dickey. Now, again, don't hate the player of the game. That's the way these things go. Use the media to your advantage. Get it. I thought there were lots of perks to having Jeremiah Dickey on campus. I even think I talked about in 2 or 3 podcast episodes about like how he could be a great fit, right? But truthfully, I think ultimately it's Jeremiah Dickey's loss, right? Now, I don't know if Houston ever contacted him on an under the table kind of way. I talked to 1 or 2 people that said he'd kind of stopped responding to some of the Houston donor texts and stuff like that, and I feel like that meant that he was in a negotiation or something. I don't know if that means anything, right? I do think, though, that if Jeremiah Dickey really did have any contact with Houston and just didn't get reported or isn't being reported accurately, and he turned it down to get an extension of Boise State, that's his loss. He's missing the boat here because Power 4 football, Power 4 sports is separating more and more from the Group of 5 every single week. Not every month, not every year, every single week. These things are separating more and more. And while he's doing very well at Boise State, the more they separate, the more that experience is going to be kind of all for naught because it's not going to be anything like what the job would be at a Power 4 institution, right? I don't know when his next chance to make that jump would be. I'd imagine it's summer of 2028 with a contract running on 2029. But ultimately, Houston was a place that would have welcomed him back with open arms because it's welcoming him back, right? Now, I still really like, of the people I've done extensive research on, Keli Zinn, the LSU executive AD. LSU has been very successful across the board in the sport that she's in the sports that they compete in the SEC while she's been there. 3 different national titles while she's been on campus. Revenue's up 21% in her 2 years there. Built a whole relationship-based NIL program called NILSU. Different content kind of based initiatives where the players get to really control their stories and they can be as involved or not involved in that as they desire. Because some kids, you got to remember, this NIL thing is not as big as deal to as it is others. So it's really kind of a whatever kids want to get out of it, they can. It's a really cool program. She could bring that kind of experience to Houston. She had extensive time at West Virginia, a Big 12 school. She helped navigate getting into that conference. So she's seen what it's like to be new to the Big 12. She was also the interim AD at West Virginia. So she's been an interim AD, so an AD at the Big 12. She's been at the Big 12 tables. I like her a lot. And I say this to endorse her. I don't have any reporting saying anything outside of the fact that I think she'd be a great candidate. I understand the LSU job is a lot different. LSU makes a lot more money, a lot more cash coming into LSU, and navigating funds. A lot of people would say, well, of course, it's easy to spend money well when you're LSU. You got a lot of money, right? I would just say that I think that she's started some very cool things there, and Jeremiah Dickey seems to be unavailable. I like Keli Zinn a lot. As we get closer to that first football game, I feel like we're going to hear more and more about this, including a decision. Now, Keli Zinn is just, after researching a handful of names who I like right now, I want to know who you like right now. So tell me in the comments down below. I know you got some thoughts and opinions. Everyone does. If there's a name I'm missing, let me know. Again, I don't not talk to Keli, not talk to people in Couture's office, not talk to big money donors about who they're putting their money behind. I just think she'd be really darn good at it. Now, if you want to hear more about the Big 12 and this potential expansion, what all's going on, any of that, Locked On Big 12 needs to be your second listen of the day. So go check out Drake Toll and them over there. They're doing a great job of covering everything about the Big 12, preseason polls, who's in, who's out, all the things. Make sure you go check them out at Locked On Big 12. Locked On Coogs is proud of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team, our Houston Cougars, each and every day. Go Cougs.